Hello everyone, today we talk about post-Carolingian Europe and the formation of the principalities or seigneuries, whatever you want to call it. And it's kind of strange that after 3 years of Schwerpunkt and more actually, I proposed myself to talk in detail at some point about all these various, in fact, dynastic powers were emerging from after the collapse fundamentally of the Carolingian Empire and that mechanism. And also we have discussed extensively, but not quite intensively, not quite much in detail either. And that was one of, however, yes, I've always thought this, and I have reinforced this idea, one of the single most important foundational moments in the history of Western civilization. Which is strange apparently because it's the story of a collapse. So actually of a decline of some sort of quite tough moment that brought to the to disorder compared to what the previous system had been about, into a fragmentation that such principality. Today we talk about principalities just for the sake of uniformity, but meaning. I prefer seigneuries, telling you the truth. So these private powers that emerged out of this fragmentation had to cope with the most concrete problems of government, right? Again, quite a turbulent reality. People like to identify as causally into just the Vikings, the Magyars, the Saracens, but actually was pretty intensely messed up, let's say, from the within, right? This is what, in a sense, the degrees of so much foundation in this moment, that these three kingdoms we discussed today, so namely the Western Frankish Kingdom, the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, and the Kingdom of Italy, as essentially the post-Carolingian or Carolingian successor state. Never heard called in this way because they weren't exactly successors to the Carolingians per se, but to this greater, actually, the thing that was the empire, right? The imperium still to be defined properly as Roman in the West, right? Because it would be the Ottonians. We made a video about this. That switched from properly the Frankish Empire to the Roman Empire, right? With an important ideological change that even there will be very impacting, not just because many people, in my opinion, wrongly identify properly 962 the birth of the whole of something called Holy Roman Empire that technically wasn't born there. Well, it was created, in a sense, wasn't even created because the empire is never created. It's something that it's a faculty that given by God fundamentally in virtue of your birth, of your power, and that is the same. That is the confirmation of the same fundamentally, and that, however, ideologically took this mantle, took this clothing in a strictly Roman sense up to the 19th century, right? And this Romanity was an object of debate since the beginning, since the Ottonian historiography. And here we're not going to discuss why and how, also the papal connection, of course, that is the thing that actually made it in the first place as such. Those are all things we will revisit at some point. I made multiple videos on the Renovatio Imperii, right? But here we're talking about a system, right? In this, massive area, essentially of Central Europe, right, in nature, of these three kingdoms, and plus others, by the way, that were other entities that were forming. Think about Burgundy, or what the Saint Lotharingia originally had been. There were historically also some other counties that would fall into areas historically speaking. If I think about the Spanish mark or on the long run, there was yet the expansion towards the east, and the incorporation also of certain Western Slavic entities that hadn't been part of the Carolingian empire that would fit eventually into the Holy Roman Empire, such as the Duchy and later Kingdom of Bohemia. There is the ambiguity of the Saint Papal States that were, according to the Church, simply an extra, earthly thing, right? That they really didn't fit in the empire as such, whereas, emperors thought that, at least from a territorial point of view, the communities that lived within it were. there are many aspects, as you understand, are very important to define. In a way that was, at the end of the day, what I really believe it set that foundational character of negotiation, right? The idea that these powers having to literally not completely build, not completely from scratch everything again, but still having to mediate between each other in this very magmatic reality that was in fact enormous, that would never be fundamentally encompassed by such a large power, fundamentally until the Napoleonic era, right? And also not for long, as you know, as the boundaries of the Carolingian Empire were never re-achieved as such, and especially within the wake of that institution. But you can argue, I don't know, even the Napoleonic Empire and the French, properly the French identity, state, rule, etc., was a product, of course, of this historical path, right? It was something, you can argue that it was something like France, right? In early medieval times, there wasn't, right? There wasn't anything like Germany or Italy, but this is exactly the moment in which those boundaries, in a sense, are defined. There is a lot of debate, even here interpretationally, where people say, this is kind of teleological, functionalistic, or whatever you want to call it, deterministic vision of history to study essentially, older, the past, right, through the categories and the outcome of the same, right? What we know now, right? What this is something we can legitimately discuss also at other levels, right? Who were these peoples? Who were these nations, if they ever existed? And I have another view, because as you know, I am even I kind of at this point they called me elite conservative, but I am in this sense anti-ethno-nationalist. That is to say, I appreciate the value of nation, of cultural homogeneity. I do, but it's not everything. It cannot be, substituted in an absolutistic sense to, the effort that you have to make to deserve the dignity of being part of the superiority of human civilization. So I also passed through my, as a younger person, to my iconoclastic phase, which is normal for young people because they have to rearrange, they have to start re-understanding from scratch right now. But I reappreciated over time pretty much the idea of this continuity, right? That is not such because we have any force, any influence on the process for how it developed historically, but it's simply an observation. That is to say, yes, we don't have to interpret things teleologically, but at the same time, we have to realize that, still certain countries fundamentally emerge from the mists of history at some point, right, in the way they would become, exactly because they passed through this, right? It's not a modern invention. Of course, the idea of the nation state is quite recent, as you can argue that any political social idea is an artificial construct that we need, even just cognitively, to understand the world. And but there is also substance to it that I've reevaluated, and I stress it without any kind of nationalistic or racialistic interest whatsoever, because I believe in universal values, and therefore that's a bit difficult for me to accept in the first place as the defining element. But it's still part of the universal values, and I think the Holy Roman Empire, this delicate transitional phase, showed that was about such dualism. That is to say, which is part, I believe, of also Western civilization, especially Christianity, brought it more definitely on the fore, in a matter of conscience and of freedom, that the relation between the two, that you have to accept universal values as much, however, as the reality as it is, concretely, and to make it work concretely, right? Even democracy, after all, is based on negotiation, because fortunately we don't live in anything even remotely resembling, thank God, to direct democracy, which just be a dictatorship of the people. That's horrifying. Our democracies are based naturally on negotiation, the value of, let's try to make things work in a concrete, realistic fashion, and understanding, the instances of everybody, and try to reach a compromise from which we can all benefit kind of the most. And sometimes this is not possible, so that's also why, wars happen in a way. So that it's always an open option, right? But I guess the history of this war shows us how, in fact, how strong such the glue that started from these post-Carolingian kingdoms was to maintain, after all, the character of a civilization, even after essentially the evaporation of the same Carolingian power. Right, we have talked a lot about the nature of Carolingian power, its private nature, the fact that there was no state, fundamentally, that the best they could do was co-opting the church in the process, but everything was privatistic in Frankish society since a very long time, also because of the Gallo-Roman background, that it had been remained like that, and that this made a huge difference, right? Never give for granted, the differences between a privatistic dynastic system, for example, such as this one, in a sense, that by the 10th century, especially, is considered a bit like the apotheosis, but not quite, right? There is something more that, I can't even digress on specifically. And, a state, a centralized system, even banally cities or literacy, right? A professional army, things like these, that can be maintained in different, professional armies can be maintained in different ways, but also, does this have an imperial form, like the Carolingian one, right, or the Frankish one in general, or does this have kind of a more of a statal form, a bit like, the Anglo-Saxons or the Longobards? This is interesting because there are many similarities as much as differences between these countries, but the interesting thing is exactly this one, that these countries, as different as they are, and believe me, understanding the deep differences, but also the deep similarities between France, Germany, and Italy is key for understanding human history in general, because of the value of Western civilization, of what these countries put out in different ways, but still reconnecting to such past for which it had been an effort also to uniform, right? As we were saying before, even think about the Carolingian script, the system of knowledge sharing, right, and exchange, right? The manuscripts, the Carolingian script, that is essentially what we still use, and the fact that countries like Saxony, like Lombardy, were brought, down, were conquered, were occupied, but they contributed eventually with different let's say elements, characteristics, nature to eventually the system overall. Think about the Ottonians, Saxony, paradoxically the least developed, all these countries, but still the one that brought more kind of military faculty in reinjecting the system, rebuilding the empire, reconnecting it also with Italy, that instead had remained definitely the most economically thriving and most civilly, legally advanced, right, the most urbanized. In France, that maintained this important dynastic strength, even at the expense of, paradoxically, of the centralized structure for which the French kings would have had to struggle, in fact, for centuries before reacquiring a control over this enormous land that was, that eventually was to take off. Like by the modern age, these countries, essentially, France was the strongest power around, and would remain one of the largest militaries and military cultures in states, and up to this day. At the time, Germany and Italy were the most technologically advanced countries out there. Think about the Italian Renaissance and how this impacted modern Europe. And this is these are all things that, in a sense, were born in different times, right? In different moments, and surely also before the Carolingian and post-Carolingian. Before the Carolingian times, but that remained intertwined, right, and unhinged, right? I'd say actually kept together, not unhinged, kept together exactly after this experience of Carolingian imperial nature, but that systemically we could define Vesselatic beneficiary, which is also a bit of a mystery, meaning that how, it's not a mystery really, you can understand it. It's based on that negotiation we were talking about before that eventually boomed dramatically in the High Middle Ages, whereas other systems that were objectively by early medieval standards more advanced, such as the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic Caliphates, that were essentially continuators of Roman-style centralized tradition, declined, right? And this broader Frankish blob took over at all levels of our, of Europe, of the Mediterranean, and even beyond, because the same Muslim powers, in a sense, were feudalized because of Frankish influence at some level. So there are so many intersections, compenetrations. There's no doubt about this. Things would go on for a long time, but let's say this thing was set at the time, right? Because there is a big difference between the Romano-Germanic powers in general, as they were at the beginning of the Middle Ages, and eventually what was left after the Carolingian Empire, the legacy of which is much greater than we often think, and not much in the glorifying ideological or kind of authoritaristic, I don't even know how to say that, idea of what the Carolingian Empire concretely was within itself, which should never be underestimated, especially from a military point of view, but that was able to maintain a dynamic legacy over time, something fruitful that, I don't know, the Islamic societies didn't have, the Byzantine society didn't have, and that is being studied, in fact, as such. I made videos on it. Well, the protagonists of this, so bit of an introduction here, but the protagonists of this change were powers that I'm sure most Westerners have never even heard about, or even if they did, then they never quite know what they were. In fact, that those are the ones we shall talk about in some detail, or at least a video per each at some point. And also today we will approximate a lot because there were many of them, right, within this geographical area. That took a physiognomy on their own within, in fact, these three great kingdoms, right, that ended up to collect, by the end of the 9th century, the legacy of the Carolingian Empire. So the kingdom of the Eastern Franks, that we can ideally see as Germany, right, the concept of Germany, of a Teutonic national identity, was an elite one, where it was created, in fact, in the major monastic centers of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. Germany at the time was divided still in what these were called just like that, because they were already privatistic, but also systems ruled by oligarchies as ethnic duchies that, however, represented also the state of Germany in many ways, divided between still, important geographical boundaries, forests. Germany was yet to be, developed in the process. It achieved only full by the 12th, the 13th century. It was something very peculiar. It was, in fact, also a more warlike era in terms, especially of participation of the lower classes, in a sense. Even though, of course, Frankish conquest had brought to a severe resizing of the freemen, of the middle classes. Think even about the Stellinger revolt that brought to the essentially the freemen to ally with the serfs, something inconceivable for Germanic cultures, but still because the oligarchs were bringing them down. The so-called Francia Occidentalis, so instead this other western chunk that had been in many ways the center of the real center, at least of the Carolingian Empire. There is no doubt that what we identify as Carolingian power is much more of a Neustrian Gallic thing than its Germanic roots, even though the Carolingians were Austrasians, etc. actually were, simply because those were more advanced lands. They were since a much earlier age, much more mediated, ruled, controlled by larger private by oligarchs who had much greater control on their lands, much greater infrastructures, output, resources, and consequently retinues, and for that matter also something was starting to be permanently professional retinues. and the Kingdom of Italy that fundamentally had been created as such in Longobards times, which there had been the Ostrogothic predecessor under the Roman mediation, but fundamentally, from an institutional point of view, what we know as the Kingdom of Italy was a Longobard creation that eventually the Carolingians simply incorporated within their own institutional system, which fundamentally wasn't done with any other people out there, because any other of the Carolingian satellites had been degraded to other duchies or counties, etc. The same Eastern and the Kingdom of Franks there, the Eastern and Western Francia had been created as a split, like a bit like the Western and Eastern Roman Empire, not because they had a territorially kind of a local institutional dimension on their own, right? So administratively, as it was growing, the Kingdom of the Longobards was incorporated at the same level of the Frankish kingdom, as Charlemagne bore both the Frankish and the Longobard crowns, right? Because Italy was dramatically advanced from a civil, juridical, administrative point of view, contrarily wise to basically what you have always heard about the Longobards, because you've been lied to disgustingly by people who are not even able to make the effort to read anything that is more that is less than 70 years old, and that was needed desperately by, in fact, as we were saying before, an empire without state, right? The contribution to the Carolingian school, etc. Think about the various Italians who could show from Pisa or Paul the Diacon, all these individuals, was of enormous importance because of all the think about even the church, the scholars, the scribes, the amount of people that had been always working would keep working. In fact, would make the Italic Kingdom emerge eventually still as the one of the communes of the university, and so on. And so the picture is fundamentally very composite, as you understand. These are also very faraway lands. I mean, between Bretagne and, I don't know, Benevent, or between Saxony and the Spanish market, there is really a lot, right? And there are places that speak different languages, that have different traditions, cultures, and yet they're essentially a Latin Germanic system, which is what the Romano-Germanic tradition had been founded on, right? Culturally, identically. So even here, there is something in common, something different that makes the combination quite fruitful again. And such principalities that take over from the bottom, let's say, after the collapse of public authority, are born out of, from the capacity of a count or a marquis or a duke, so a high officer of the kingdom, to autonomize themselves from royal power, right? But also to maintain the office within their own family, with their own dynasty, and to extend their own authority or influence well beyond the boundaries of the districts that had been entrusted with at the beginning, right? This was the whole Vesselatic beneficiary system was about. The Frankish administration contemplated mostly counties initially, then there were some other of these districts, such as the duchies that were not necessarily frontier areas, but let's say some certain areas that were certain districts that had an important strategic relevance, mostly, in fact, because of their power, their military capacity, that were endowed with this title of command. The marches were instead, in fact, properly demonstrated frontier areas that, as such, were historically to even evolve, right, in feudal Europe further as that specific areas of more exposed to the external, right, very often properly at the boundaries of the same Carolingian, boundaries proper, right, at the limit of them in the outer part. And also as new creations, especially if you think about the the Germanic push towards the east, right? There were lots of marches were created in that sense because, of course, they had been created in essentially hostile territory after conquest, and then they border other peoples further east. So they maintained that kind of character. But it's important to stress that, especially in the 9th, 10th centuries, like these titles were a bit still fluid, meaning that kings still existed, of course, even emperors still existed, we'll see now. It's just that their factual power was very limited. And so there was always, having such public authority was very useful because it kind of strengthened, in a sense, both actors, right? This local powers would be essentially legitimized by the king in exchange of something that it was essentially the recognition of their own authority. So that's why the system kept surprisingly intact, right? It's as if I don't know, when the Roman Empire kind of ended in the West, right? It was just an administrative thing. I give you that. There was still somebody else in Constantinople saying, nothing really happened because objectively it hadn't. But just imagine as if this system had collapsed, and the Romanity of the rule and even the imperial title had been always maintained even among the smaller powers, right? This is a bit what happened in the Carolingian Empire in itself. It would have probably happened even when you think about after the Fourth Crusade, all the ambitions, the titles of the various Byzantine successor states. It was obvious, right? It was, if you want, it's a universal dynamic. You want to keep a point of reference and moving within that system. It's a civilizational process. But the titles could be of different nature. You can be a count as much as you eventually could be a duke, etc. That depended on the weight, the specific weight this title had for the local policy, for what the king was essentially wanted to recognize you like. There was still a lot of district making, right, in terms properly of engineering, either, as we've seen before, creation of new districts or expansion of others. There were certain dynastic dynamic naturally were bringing to the incorporation sometimes rather than the split at every generation of the same, but it was still a problem in many ways. So there were solutions that we talked about also in other videos. So we're talking about thus fluid and unstable entities, right? Definitely the second invasions didn't quite help in general, but there is a resilience in these centers that is astonishing, right? Objectively, we overestimate invaders, we overestimate barbarians, we overestimate anybody that fundamentally emerges surprisingly, almost all of a sudden when, surprise, actually, the big giant is collapsing internally, right? So these powers, these invasions are actually subordinated to these powers' weaknesses, which means automatically how powerful they really were, right? The future of certain peoples was not to be as we imagine it, right? What was the Viking era after itself, after all? What had it achieved in terms of institutional, political? It had all the Frankish world, broadly met, had always remained the advanced, functional one, right? The one that independently from cultural sympathies or stereotypes we want to believe about, but that we were not taught enough at school for how, because we often identify that moment as the darkness of the Middle Ages and the dysfunctionality, the problem. When you actually go study what these powers did concretely from within themselves, you realize that they even this kind of almost obsession for external threat that we have built in the West for some reason, essentially passing on the defensive and losing the initiative, and therefore kind of declassating our own civilization that was so strong already at the time, shows you that in fact these single powers could afford in a sense to live in a fragmented system because they weren't such under a big threat of annihilation in absolute terms, right? The reason we have talked about this recently also, how could the Vikings make it in France? How could the Magyars make it in Germany? How the Saracens could make it in Italy if it hadn't been for the same French or Germans or Italians that were actually inviting them for their own internal matters, right? And why did this system eventually from, in the High Middle Ages boomed dramatically and took the upper hand and spread everywhere, right? And took the initiative and, think about the trade balance in Mediterranean, in fact, the end of the Vikings, the framing of, the Slavs, the Hungarians under a certain hegemony. I mean, this is an important way of looking at history, because we're almost always prevented from having it. This is not to say that, those threats were jokes, or that they weren't important, that they didn't have important structural damage, but exactly because of that, you would say that if these local systems had been weak, they would have been wiped out by them. Instead, they weren't. They weren't, and they weren't systemically. That is to say, these systems survived all over the line, within all the system, right? And they weren't to stop. It wasn't a historical accident. It's the same countries we live in today, right? And this is a huge deal, and that's why it's important to stress, in my opinion, the continuity from those times onwards, because certain characters that were set there were not to essentially to be altered further. Some of them, but the rest is part of a development, of an evolution, let's say. And as we were saying in the beginning, some historians call them principalities, other signories. That these terms recur also in the later Middle Ages for describing certain powers. So, conventionally, these are just names, right? You shouldn't bother yourself more than much and to be a vocabulary Nazi to say, okay, what do we have to use? Be sure that every time, unless it's probably a grammar problem, how you define certain powers doesn't quite matter, as long as you understand what these powers were factually about, right? So let's not be, and most people will stop to, no, they weren't Byzantines but Romans, or most of the times, because they don't understand anything even about that Roman history, even if you call it Byzantine, to more or less understand what we're talking about. But this is another issue again. So as we were saying, an important feature of these powers is that they were title holders of an office received by the sovereign, right? And in the majority of the principalities, it is possible to distinguish an internal area, not necessarily geographically meant, right? Geometrically meant, but depending on naturally how these patrimonies were built, or these assets were built, these powers were constructed. That was constituted normally, however, by the counties, right? That had been the base from which the prince had exercised in first person, personally, public authority, where properly the public authority was connected to, right? And then an external area that can fit, in fact, even within the county, if there are private properties, right? And that's the example. For as far as also very far away, or even hundreds of kilometers, where he can intervene. Thanks to the good relations with other counts, for example, that are also often his vassals, and this is all private, right? The Vesselatic beneficiary relations here are just very fluid adjustments that eventually we think at the feudal hierarchy and all these things, but at this point they were almost completely devoid of any kind of recognizable hierarchy. Okay, there were many counties with different power, right? And of course the kings were powerful. Sometimes principalities were more powerful than the monarchies, and this is easy to understand even later on. Look at the Kingdom of France with the Normans that are also kings of England and so on. Of Aquitaine, they rule in Aquitaine and other Poitou, etc. But so as always, every principality has its own history and characteristics that depend on the circumstances, the means that have allowed certain families to accumulate their hands a good number of public offices, also ecclesiastical ones, importantly enough, because they're basically the same people. Here the elite is basically homogeneous, right? Ecclesiastical offices had already been overlapping in a sense to many of these public offices, right, bishops had taken matters in their own hands, right? Also, there is the figure of Bishop Counts, is very, very, very famous for Ottonian Italy, for that matter. But also, which is something different from the, this is the secular clergy proper, so bishops, right, etc. And that, and their hierarchy, I mean, that was quite territorial, was overlapped with the lay districts and so on. Then the dukes and the marquis, as we were saying before, had districts located often at the margins of the Rhine, not always, but still they profited of the distance and the power that fundamentally separated them from central authority to autonomize themselves from the royal tutelage, to expand their influence beyond the limits of their own district. This is for France especially the case in all the dominations of the southern part of the kingdom, that, as you know, was an area culturally quite separated from the north historically, and that autonomized itself given the struggles of the Western Frankish crown in the north, in that they fit formally within the boundaries of the Western Frankish kingdom, but they had always been kind of ambiguous for that matter, and quite unwilling to recognize the supremacy of the Franks, because this is what we are talking about. I mean, northern France is factually what the Franks were in this region, and well, the south had been historically something else, more tied to the Visigoths, to the Burgundians, and sometimes also looking at the coexistence with Islamic powers. Like even here, if Fraxinetum existed, it's because there was a political will at the international level that you would be surprised entailed actually the Ottonians and the Caliphate of Cordoba. And as soon as the thing ended, the Counts of Provence took Fraxinetum out in the blink of an eye. I mean, from there the Saracens arrived to pillage until the Rhine Valley, right? So even across the Alps. I mean, it was really that gives you an idea of the complexity of these relations, by the way, but also how they were dependent on factors that are a bit more than just the outer invaders, and that there is always a deeper political concreteness for these things to happen in the first place. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't anarchy as we think about it. Complexity doesn't mean anarchy, right? Remember that. So starting from in southern France, I mean, this various comital ducal dynasties, starting from the second half of the 9th century. We made a video on the county of Toulouse a month ago. Substituted themselves completely to royal authority. That is to say, properly, they fell so out of any concrete, for example, military capacity of the military strategic reach of the Western Frankish kings, that it's as if for centuries they lived in another country, as they had always been, kind of. And we're talking about the counts of Poitiers in Aquitaine, the dukes of Gascony between the Garonne and river and Navarre, the counts of Barcelona and Catalonia, and so on, right? Which were powerful entities, by the way, right? And also in here, different in nature, right? The south of France was more urbanized, right? Kind of was more similar to Italy historically, also more, and also just closer to it because of contacts of cultural exchange and so on. But we're talking also about quite powerful dynasties, of course, that were, trying to, in fact, extend themselves, their control on these communities, right? Urban ones, there were bitter struggles and so on. And this probably also brought to a sort of instability, right, in the area for which this country didn't quite emerge in any significant way. There was naturally the Provence as such, the Kingdom of Arles, that, however, didn't quite make it, right, in the end. But especially southwestern France, right, had an important level of, civilizational development. It's just that it didn't evolve into a unitary reality, and or at least one provided with a greater systemic reach that could surpass even the ambiguity of the presence of a commune and a county at the same time. For example, in Italy, they got rid of the problem as feudalism kind of, was suppressed by the communes, right? It always existed as a system. They were perfectly part of. It's just that, the nobility was marginal, or at least ended up urbanizing, being part of the commune itself. It was a power on its own, right? In France, in the north, this problem didn't exist because it was mostly just a dynastic system, right? So the cities would be important, but they didn't have much of a chance against to counter the nobiliary power, right? In Germany, it was a bit more composite, but there was also kind of less of a stage of development that eventually took off mostly in favor of in the absence of essentially even there of a kind of a centralized public urbanized culture, a feudal character from the mid 12th century, right? So that Germany is a feudal country indeed by the 13th, and also quite strongly so, in spite of the free cities and all this stuff, right? But they didn't have much of a reach outside of their city walls, right? Outside was the prince that ruled. So in Italy, for a while, in this centuries, there was the coexistence between various systems. Actually, there were powerful dynasties there. For example, the dukes of Friuli and of Spoleto, right? That contained the imperial crown. Think even about the proximity to Rome. This is important for those times. Like, how much can you pressure on that, exercise political pressure on the city, right? It's very different to do it from France, right? Especially when you don't even control the whole country. The Ottonians would do it, but also the German grip didn't quite last and was actually supported by the same communities of the Italic Kingdom, their elites. The Ottonians also, the Marquis of Tuscany from 846 to 931. I mean, the Adalberts and the Ottonians eventually, who managed to bring under their control, actually, under their direct administration specifically, 7 counties corresponding to important cities, quite developed area. This counted Lucca, Pisa, Volterra, Luni, Pistoia, Florence, and Fiesole, right? So it was an enormous asset. They extended their domination up to the Emilian side of the Apennine, so that they could control also the Apenninic passes, and to cash, right, the tolls of the tolls for the crossings. And they were so rich to make of Lucca, their capital, one of the most prosperous cities in the West, right? Even though this was all a private system, right? The city was seat of a brilliant courtly life, and they were so powerful to be able to entertain direct relations, right, with Constantinople, with the Byzantine Emperor, and with the Caliph of Baghdad. So the proximity of royal power didn't prevent elsewhere, however, the formation of wide principalities in the same heartland of the Western Frankish kingdom itself, right? For example, between the Seine and the Loire, so what had been properly the heart also of Frankish power in many ways, were the Marquis of Neustria, that were title holders of a really incredible amount of lay and ecclesiastical offices, ensured the protection, right, the defense of the kingdom against the Bretons, the Normans, right. The same can be said in also another very deeply Frankish area that is the one just northeast of Paris, that is theater in the first half of the 10th century of the incredible expansion of the Counts of Vermandois. Those were the core of that kind of ultra-elite, privatistic, would-be feudal, right, system, right? This is where properly the military, also the major military developments of the wars were catalyzed, right? That's where the heartland of heavy cavalry and its intensive training, its professionalism, its shock charges, thickly packed arrays, etc., would make the difference, really. That's what managed to keep the Normans at bay, right? Making them settle, yes, in the lower Seine valley, and also coping with the Bretons, etc., that were warlike peoples, and yet, they managed to stem them, and not only, but also to absorb them, so that by the time of the conquest of England, the Normans were factually and exclusively French, right, in everything, in culture, in military organization, in language, in politics, in society, in writing, in everything, right? They were an exact, perfect copy of the Western Frankish model and nothing else, right? It didn't matter at all that they had been Danish, Norwegians, whatever. They were also not just, that, they were also Western Frankish for that matter, but that's how, impacting such models as Western Frankish model had been in the region. And in these three kingdoms, the monarchy remained in a way or another. There were different fates, right? Or let's say fate is a bit too deterministic, but let's say, again, we can identify this the reasons, the causes that brought on the long run to the different outcomes, right? At this point, what is important though is that such monarchies remained because of the initial splits of the treatises since Verdun and so on that had occurred in the Carolingian, well, even before, because the problem there was also succession one. I made a video I remember the title of it, but in Carolingian Europe playlist you can find plenty of this stuff. Let's say about the relative, even in here, randomness, let's say, of the split of the divide, right? It's difficult from one side because the Carolingian, yes, they weren't even thinking at that point they would split all the thing at some point. That there was the greater with Charles III, it was the greater recombination of all the recollection of all the kingdoms, etc. But eventually, after him, things split once again because there were dynamics that were pushing for it. But let's say also the geographical boundaries were not completely random, right? The greater ambiguity mostly stood in the eastern Western Frankish border, like the fact of a Lotharingia had existed, this area that encompassed factually also Italy, because let's stress it, the Italic Kingdom was the most important. It was the one that institutionally contained Rome, and the fact that that you needed, and this was set since Charlemagne, Louis the Pious onwards, of course the papacy, and so the possibility of being crowned, so that no emperor could be emperor without being king of Italy. And this was an important deal if you think about the mechanism that stood also ideologically behind these things, because that naturally reflects the power of the papacy that had been there had always been an ambiguity between papacy and empire at that level because of the many territorial ambitions that the same church had in Italy especially. But the question there was that nobody denied that in order to become emperor, you had to secure control of Italy. And this was a deeper reason than just, the papal prerogatives. It was probably about the idea of the sacrality of the empire and the fact that the sanctionment from internationally deriving from the papacy was necessary together with the control of Italy as we have seen the most developed of these countries to be the power, not something strange, right? When we think about, I think this is important also for a Southern European perspective, that when we think about the early Middle Ages, heavy Middle Ages, we say it's as if at some point the Germans arrived, began to rule everywhere, the Romans disappeared, and it's all about the north. This wasn't actually the case. Like, you can't wipe out thousands of years of civilization in an era that still had the infrastructure, the wealth, etc., right? A country like Italy maintained the highest per capita wealth in the world uninterruptedly. That is, even among all these wars, the migration era, etc., from Roman times to the end of the 17th century, right? So you understand also why the Holy Roman Empire, like why did the Germans united Italy to their own system and left France out, that after all was the most prestigious of all kingdoms in terms, as we've seen, of factual power, and also considering the Carolingian legacy that mostly has stemmed from there. But because it was obviously the most beneficial to conquer, it was the richest and the most politically divided. And so it was the best for an imperial policy to gain control, right? The dream of the Ottonians, of the Swabians, etc., was of course to rule from a place like Rome, and for making of Germany a sort of peripheral province, because the advantages deriving from that, just in terms of sheer wealth, of strategic possibilities, the same location in the midst of Mediterranean, the papal control, all these things were obviously what any emperor in a universal ambition would have concretely, or anybody else for that matter, would have concretely sought. So this also is yet another trend, because Holy Roman Imperial history is often told so, like it doesn't figure more than much. For I guess for most people, Middle Ages are stopped to, a bunch of kingdoms, right? Mostly in the West. The thing is, England and just France, because the English fought against, the French all the time. But let's say there were so many other realities that, of course, I don't think that there is necessarily an Anglo-centric view of the Middle Ages, especially today. But let's say there is maybe rather a lack of a Southern European perspective in the Middle Ages, that if you look at them, were always like the most advanced areas were in Southwestern Europe. There is no way to even doubt of this. There are important divides, like in fact this Frankish system, as we were talking about before, is something that, again, I think especially France, Germany, and Italy have this specific role. Let's say eventually a country like England even, can fit this perfectly, because it was a Norman, hence a French country. Even if, probably my British audience will hate me, at least my English audience will hate me for this, but it was factually it. Like England was molded on the base of a Frankish power. The same goes for Muslim Sicily. The same goes even for other principalities that the Westerners established after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, and all the models derived from there. But there is also to understand that this dynamic, the kind of more warlike, less developed north that is able to send waves of warriors to kind of control the richest, more populated areas in the south, that however ends up unavoidably in a hybrid, right? We were talking about it just last week, that when we look at the barbarian invasions, we're actually looking at the hybridization of elites, right? These countries weren't fundamentally altered in their ethnic character, in their cultural legacies. That it was obvious. We talked about this a lot, even when looking at law, at identities, cultures. Just think about this, that the Franks or the Longobards were ruling on Romance basis, but they still thought of them as the Franks, as the Longobards. That is to say, they were Germanized formally in culture, even though they spoke Latin, and they basically, especially in the south, that they had an overwhelming continuity in the administrative, written, juridical tradition of Rome, and or what had transformed, of course, after the fall of Rome, but still from bases that were even, look at the church. I mean, the top cultural, elite in a sense, that was able to organize such a system consensually, that is, without having factually being a superpower in military force, etc., but being able to convince the world Westerners that they had fundamentally to cooperate alongside the pattern of a Roman Catholic Church. Now, this is a huge deal if you look at the moral dimension of medieval developments, especially at this time, right? And there was more than this, of course, at a local level. For example, so you see, kings in these countries remained because of the Carolingian repartitions, right? And because they maintained a minimal capacity to intervene in the territories, even when, as we've seen, it was so difficult, not much because of any external perturbation, but rather of the power, the domestic power of the princes that were, factually obstacling them from having a direct control, right? And that historically would take quite a lot of time before they could re-achieve, modern subtle sense. Consider the power of the church in itself. I mean, the fact, not much just the Church of Rome, but the church quite materially meant in the form of, let's say, the properly ecclesiastical administration and all the lands that were endowed to them, and the fact that these clergy men were factually the same people coming from the elite, right? Either if you came from the elite, you were either one of those knights or a bishop or an abbot. They came from the same cultural milieu, right? They even shared kind of the same lifestyle almost. We made quite a time ago that video on Gerald of Aurillac that shows essentially a lay sanctity, right? The idea that even an abbot could fundamentally be just like a knight, and everybody being okay with that, because it kind of comforted the feelings of the local population in these turbulent times. It properly was a picture of grandeur, of superiority, right? The church shared in this regard. So the church also was not so unitarily strong and organized like, in the 13th century, and Roman power asserted itself gradually over this. But the church was so important in this regard because its prerogatives, its sanctity, that for a reason or another was maintained because it was believed to be so, and allowing therefore these assets that couldn't be quite touched, not even by secular authority, by not creating a bit of a problem internationally, but also domestically, because the same princes used the same ecclesiastical policy on their own to endow their children with such powerful abbeys, monasteries, and so on, was the best form of political organization, right? The church in all this was the system that held the greatest unity in the whole thing, and also think about the monastic reforms, etc. All these, the monasteries were literally the cultural connective tissue of post-Carolingian Europe, right? There was a great contact between monasteries. Also, this some of the greatest prejudices I've always told you ever since I started this channel talking about medieval history is the idea that in the Middle Ages people didn't travel, that people in monasteries, monks were isolated. That this is completely, it's the diametrically opposite reality that we get from the sources. There was an enormous exchange, and this took the scale of the whole post-Carolingian area. These areas were used now to be one, right? I'm thinking just now, think about just the European Union, that there is a real tradition of these things that we cannot dismiss just and say because you don't like what the European Union does, so you want to throw it away altogether, while you don't understand it. Factually, Europe emerges from its own unity in diversity that means, a diversity that includes, however, a strong commonality at the same time. And look at times where there were no international, there weren't superpowers, there was nobody forcing what do these systems do? They stick together, one another, with all if you want, the contradictions, the hostilities, the competition, etc. But the system held. Again, post-Carolingian Europe wasn't going like, like in completely different directions that eventually, took completely different, began to start completely different institutions in other geographical directions. No, this thing remained because it was understood to be of enormous profit for all these peoples that, in fact, dramatically capitalized on this over the centuries to make Europe in the way we know, because all the system was eventually Francicized. The British Isles, the Iberian Peninsula, Scandinavia, the Western Slavs, great part of the Balkans. It's kind of obvious, right? And beyond, right? So it cannot be ignored. It cannot be. You can't say, well, this is just a perspective. No, this is actually how the single most important thing that happened in high medieval history in this regard and beyond, right? With important prodromes, because this was not to be given for granted, right? The same Carolingian Empire was not to be given for granted. If, just, I don't know, Charlemagne and Louis the Pious had not remained without alive siblings, the Carolingian Empire would have not existed. Let's be honest about this. They would have had a completely different history, and surely there would have been some other ways of integration, of cooperation. There's no doubt. But in here, the wake within which these realities kept developing, in spite of all their shortcomings, their fault in public management, all these things, it's still remarkable. And it's exactly the fact that it happened so granularly from the top, from the bottom up, is that what is most striking for eventually what was to be built. Let's pick France, for example. Like France, here there was the idea that the legitimacy of a king depended on Carolingian blood, right, that ran in his veins, and this brought paradoxically to a halt of the competition between the great of the kingdom, right, that had, let's say, some other ambition. Let's say at some point they were so intertwined that they couldn't quite conflict with each other, even though limiting, let's say, the emergence of a single ruler, right, or at least mediating it in a way that would take a long time before this could happen. The Western Frankish kingdom may have not, let's say, emerged in the times, in the spaces we think of it quite easily, right? It was paradoxically, by the 10th century, the least obvious of the kingdoms to evolve. But if you, from an institutional point of view, but if you look at in fact, this kind of privatistic glue that was based on this concept, on this dynastic concept, and also this almost ematophilia, right? The idea properly that there was a quasi-racial superiority in the nobility that was of ferocious military nature, also ideally was able to compact power further, which is almost paradoxical. The real battleground, in a sense, at least the more unstable system in this regard, was the Italic one, right? The Italic one was, as we've seen, very synetic because of the resources it had, but also very unstable because it hadn't. The main reason was that the distribution of wealth was much more even than in all these other countries. That is to say, let's say the same level of let's say concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer people, like in France, that is the extreme example, did not quite exist. So there were powers that were kind of a hybrid between the Frankish feudal, say, Vesselatic beneficiary system and something more kind of public in nature that was still, also an element sometimes against the same dynasties that made the Italic kingdom split in these various centers of power that kind of were very interactive, right? They competed over essentially the imperial crown, right? Because they could support the papacy. I mean, think about Spoleto, for example. It's next door to Rome, so they obviously had a great leverage at that level just because of the proximity. But in this area between 887 and 962, so up to the Ottonian conquest, that changed a bit, a lot of, let's say, the consolidation, probably the Roman imperial power of the Ottonians. The region, the kingdom, was controlled by, was occupied, let's say, by at least 9 claimants: Berengar, Marquis of Friuli, Guy of Spoleto and his son Lambert, Arnulf of Carinthia. Because let's remember that northeastern Italy technically fit at this point in southeastern Germany, strictly speaking. There were different areas, but still the Alps weren't quite of a barrier, because it's always about politics, not much about geography, like people disagree, but still. Louis of Provence, Rodolphe of Burgundy, right? Hugh of Provence and his son Lothar, Berengar, Marquis of Ivrea, right? So these were all, if you want, up to the Ottonians, minor pretense. I mean, they were very wealthy and important. I mean, I think about Arnulf of Carinthia, or even, Rodolphe of Burgundy, but especially Hugh of Provence, right? There were these centers mostly were Spoleto or Tuscany or the Friuli region, or Piedmont with the Ivrea, with this other, also kind of Lombard power technically. But we see the fragmentation of this era for many reasons. Politically, as we've described the situation of the Italic Kingdom. The fact that this division invited naturally external players, right? And this is a trend that would have, set in Italian history since this time. Also because in practice, what the Franks had done had been this: they had invaded and conquered Italy, so they were essentially the Northerners, the Franks, that had occupied this country. So eventually, the other pretendants, the Burgundians, the Bavarians, eventually the Saxons, etc., they still interfered in this system, because it was also easy to connect, areas like the Rhone Valley, like Arles, etc., with Tuscany, with Rome herself, and also in part because it was always kind of an unstable era that everybody was, for the aforementioned reason, trying to compact together, but it failed at a certain point in every case, because the local elites didn't kind of allow that, right? The system was so unstable that as soon as somebody saw that there was a major claimant to the imperial, let's say, or holder imperial title that was becoming too strong, the other sides would compact against them. And so they would take him out. The same Ottonian conquest is a big deal, right? This we will see it now, was always based on the support of the local elites. There was no other way to rule. The Saxons didn't factually even control, half of Germany. How could they control Rome without any of these things? But paradoxically, that's what favored the empire, and favored the continuity of the Holy Roman Imperial system in fact, properly in an imperialistic sense, meaning that even though this is also debatable, in fact, because France in that regard was much more of an imperialistic system, because it had factually controlled the surrounding satellites, whereas Germany was about having a ruling dynasty that floated over the other powers, which is an important distinction, because, as you know, even the attempt of centralizing Germany would fail in the long run, right? When we look at Italy and Germany, we're looking at it. Also, the Italians tried to have with these individuals, especially later on, even against the same Ottonians. There were some Italic revolts of the nobility, guided by they wanted to. They were elected kings of Italy, and it seemed that there could be such a thing like an Italian monarchy, but the thing eventually never gained, even in their consistency, because again, the same actors began to say, okay, these guys are too strong, we want to just enjoy our decentralized position, our traffics, our maritime potential. And that's also how the communes would rise, and the decline of that feudal element that then instead would remain strong in France and in Germany, right? But it's worth noticing that of all these post-Carolingian kingdoms, at the end of the day, the only one that had a real continuity with the dynastic rule was France, right? Also, Germany had, of course, an elective monarchy that remained, but the possibility of creating a real dynastic, like a national monarchy, essentially succeeded just in France and in the French product of England fundamentally. So it's that there are interests of being like in the Iberian Peninsula. It was also deeply Francicized, but there were also other reasons why a dynasty like Castile or Portugal would make it, right? Whereas also Aragon wouldn't. So there are many, or at least not in that strong centralized power that we know. So these are all dynamics that are set in many ways at this point in history. So what happened in Germany is that the choice of the great princes of the kingdom concentrated on a dynasty, the ones of the Dukes of Saxony, that were quite warlike in nature. They had, however, carried out, they were a hybrid between the best of Carolingian tradition, the best of Saxon tradition, that is to say, this intense social, political engineering, building castles, think about Henry the Fowler and how much it left to Otto I to become the one he was. This pressure from the Slavs in the eastern frontier, so the need to maintain armed these people and to make the Saxony coalesce as a duchy proper, as a power endowed with this important command, strategical function, that was chosen as the ruling dynasty because of the success in pushing out the Magyar invasion and concentrating the German forces to south of the Alps, right? So setting this trend again that had already existed before, but from the Eastern Frankish side, not quite as much. That was yes, there was some episode like before Arnulf of Carinthia, but I mean, during the 10th century things had gone rapidly deteriorating in Germany as well because of the raids, all these things. But they managed, right, to bear the Iron Crown of the kings of Italy in 961, right, and to receive the imperial crown from Pope John XII in February 962. So this creation remained, right, and the most striking aspect of it, aside from the fact that the Saxons were the least of they were the arch enemies of the Franks in a sense, and paradoxically they were the ones who managed to recreate the empire on a Frankish model, right? So it's not a way to trigger those who think that the Saxons were just poor martyrs that got conquered brutally by the Franks. So that was actually a great seminal phase in the history of Western civilization, because Saxony is one of the best examples of the success of Carolingian conquests and, in fact, social engineering, etc., because it made them a functional system. There was Frankish in nature, was Frankish in substance of political, institutional, military dimension, even with all the differences that existed between Western France and Germany, and that managed also to reconnect with the Frankish grandeur by essentially having as main center of power Saxony plus Franconia, so actually the most Francicized region in Germany, the one colonized since Merovingian times and so on, to kind of claim, to obtain, to hint, even informally if you want, Germany to Italy throughout all essentially Holy Roman Imperial history, right, in a way or another. And this axis that is remarkable, as we were saying before, because these were two countries that didn't eventually make it to develop unitary systems, but had still maintained this federal system at the end of the day that had kept them together. Doesn't matter how different also they were in practice, as we were saying before, and there will always be this kind of confrontations. Think about the Hohenstaufen and the Lombard League, but also even before the struggle for investitures and so on. But they still stuck together, right? But the other element that is interesting in here is that the Holy Roman Empire kept out the Kingdom of France, right? And part of the reason, of course, is that that was too tough of a nut to crack, because what would have been the German interest to kind of invade France at that point, right? The French had overwhelming power. They were, already like so intricately entrenched in their own lordships. They were so advanced. They were developing everything in terms of military structures and castellation, in a scale that was not to be seen elsewhere. And Germany had it kind of easier to subdue the Slavs, right? They were kind of more backwards. They were more primitive. They were, even in there, they took a lot of time to subdue them, to actually also catalyze a process for which, in fact, the new Duchy of Bohemia and was incorporated in the empire, and the same imperial hegemony would be extended over Poland and Hungary. But they, in this sense, they kind of structured better, also the political institutional development of Germany, because even in there were new actors that could be now co-opted, could be employed in this international definition of power, could be at that point Germany had the upper hand over these powers, right? Didn't have an interest even in there to expand militarily on them more than much, but the Germanization of many areas, the literal expansion of Germany in a demographic sense, in that dimension, was deeply intertwined with the development of those same countries. That this way they couldn't quite escape, broadly speaking, the Central European, I would say Commonwealth. It's a bit excessive, because there was a few in common in a way, and not too much of a wealth, frankly. But it was still a way, again, to mediate more easily a political order. And actually, most of the German effort would be directed again towards Italy, trying to effectively secure the control on its riches, on the papacy, and that ultimately failed. But still, this produced, especially if you look at the investiture controversy, but even the same clashes between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, all these things, an enormous civilizational output. We would have not had the same development of Roman law or canonic law, or the same federal system of Germany if this thing hadn't happened, right? And we constantly overlook how impacting this thing was for Western civilization. I mean, I don't have to explain with my avatar how much I owe myself to Middle European culture, and it's kind of frustrating to see how Westerners do not quite give much credit to this, as if it was just like a peripheral thing, or at least it wasn't properly addressed as one of the pillars of the Western world. But this is a fault of perspective. It may be, there are many reasons why we do this, but still, again, it was born at this point. And we could go on this. We could observe all the ambiguities on which this systems legally operated. I mean, on the fact that there was an order, yes, and it was much more coherent than we think. But in order to explain this, we should start from what the concept of empire had meant, right, and was keeping to mean for states that were for countries that were evolving gradually also towards a subtle dimension that was favored exactly by the lack of a sovereign power that could be defined exactly as such. And this is exactly what spurred like a much more refined and deeper and sophisticated understanding of political theory and practice in a time that world had never seen in the same way. Right? It's not obvious to pass from an empire where, just what the emperor says it's rule, and, a system where you recognize the necessity of an empire, but also of individual participation of the various federal elements that constitute it. And this goes beyond, again, because there wasn't, as we've just seen, the empire wasn't even just covering half of Europe. And also it did in different degrees at a local level in terms of intensity, let's say, of capacity of power. So it is fascinating, and one could even wonder what this thing would have been if there had been kind of a greater force intact, right, in at a certain time. You can evaluate, even applicate to political and social systems, kind of an attrition element, that at the end of the day there are these major inputs, then eventually they fade away and things change, and either other inputs or the thing transform into something else, right? But this is a way of mostly seeing things in perspective, and at least trying to make sense of a period in history that, again, is much less to be given for granted than we often think, just as a moment of crisis, of the second invasion, etc. But actually seeing what these powers were doing, while still fundamentally unchallenged and still confident enough to resume the initiative, as they would have done quite soon as, most, because there hadn't never been quite of a major threat. Like, maybe except the Islamic invasion, which Spain quite evidently witnessed, and also the Franks had to stop at Tours, but that also dwelled in kind of other environments in a sense. This Central European dimension was fundamentally relatively unaltered by major offensives of any sort, right? Even, yes, the Franks had to stop the Muslims, but they did early on, right, at the beginning of the 8th century. Then even at the time of the Saracens, there wasn't like a concerted effort that could make a headway into the Italian mainland or anything. The same goes for the Vikings, the same from the north, or even the same Magyars, right? There was no way these peoples could present an existential threat, if not to some chunks, let's say, some frontier areas of political, especially in Eastern Germany, right? Some areas were surely at some point destabilized by Magyars' attack. They might have been overwhelmed mostly because of the Western Slavic pressure at that point. It was always remaining and kind of favoring the same Magyar raids. But if you look at France, was there ever a moment where France was, threatened to be conquered by the Vikings? Right, the fact that they were settled in the lower Sandmouth, it actually was a success for the Western Franks, and also a success of eventual civilization in that as we've seen, perfect Francization of the Normans. In Italy too, like, what was actually Sicily was Byzantine Sicily, right? And it was so it belonged to another system, was not a Frankish one. It had never known the Vesselatic beneficiary system. The southern Italian interland was partly Francized, like even the Franks had never quite conquered it, but it had received an important influence from it. And even in there, the interland was never, like, the Saracens were simply not interested in that, right? The Saracens were there mostly to loot. They didn't even have technically demographic colonies like the Vikings had, for example. It was all more of a maritime net of piracy that was occurring because of the lack of a central power, not much because there had been a real collapse of the institutions there. So it's not that these areas weren't hit hard. Italy was, southern France was. But again, what did happen to these countries? Were they destabilized? Were they weak? couldn't they emerge? Like from the 11th century, the Italians sweep all the Western Mediterranean from Saracens, and they reconnect. Basically, they take over the whole sea. They establish all their maritime dominations from Spain to participating to the Reconquista, to the Crusades, right? Remaining the chant that had always been there, right? And it would remain even after the Crusades. The Germans kept expanding east. They consolidated as a system on their own that factually nobody ever thought to invade. Did ever invade Germany? There was no, even there, no, it wasn't worth it in a sense, but it wasn't worth it also because the country began to strengthen dramatically. Same goes for France, that becomes the largest power in Europe. And also the Germans at some point, but especially in the mid-12th century, were factually the strongest power in Europe. So we cannot see these systems again as being significantly crippled, but on the contrary, I think they were genetically strengthened by what happened exactly after the collapse of especially during the 10th century, right? I can see in the 9th century the decline, the lack of of unity, the collapse of that central fort that the Carolingians had tried to put together. But let's say it was exactly a voluntary thing. This thing was not collapsing because it was like a building without foundations. The foundations were all these various lords that now wanted to take matters in their own hands and took the chance to do it, even supporting actually the second invasions to kind of carve their own niche and autonomizing themselves from public power. A public power that, again, especially north of the Alps, hadn't quite existed as such, had always been actually a private power that had, in fact, functioned until the system could be fueled with new conquests and new land and new slaves and new, benefits in a sense. And then when this, the empire were expanded, there wasn't really any other reason for which it had to stick together, because there was no real common identity. Like, if you take Central Europe, there were lots of different peoples. There were the Franks, there were the Aquitanians, there were Burgundians, there were the Alemanni, there were the Saxons, there were Franconians, there were the Bavarians, there were the Longobards. I mean, it was like all different peoples, right? So again, it had come to that to a certain point. And yes, the Carolingian system could have held in other ways. Let's say also the dynastic element surely didn't help, as we've seen, because again, it was about splitting that that vice. The Carolingians blamed the Merovingians, of course, all the time, but it did exactly the same thing the Merovingians did in everything. Like, they were the exact copy of them. And so they never, it took centuries and centuries before understanding the splitting the entire state in equal amounts, as many as the male sons were, was, say, not a good idea for stability, but it was in a way their culture, it was their horizon. It had all those countries had evolved historically. Hell, let's be honest, the Roman Empire had ended just by 300 years before, not even 400 years before. I mean, these areas were still kind of primitive. You couldn't expect too much, right, to hold. But still, the recognition that there had to be a unity in this system that was as different as it was, paradoxically survived. And this is one of the greatest legacies of the Carolingian Empire. It's also mostly exemplified by culture, again, by the uniformation of the script, of the manuscript formats, of the monastic reform, the ecclesiastical reforms, this need to involve, of course, the church in the administration. That was an attempt to give, in fact, sap, kind of life, strength to the substance, to this statal project. You just couldn't make it with those premises, but paradoxically, from this hybrid, so much would have developed, unexpectedly probably, in Europe as we know it. And this is remarkable because, again, we're talking about regions that were sometimes very different, right? you can argue that France is just a hybrid between Italy and Germany. And it's kind of weird, but it's kind of true as well. And so it's this beyond dichotomic reality that makes you see the world in so many different ways, that again, that doesn't even stop there. Before this was a provocation about France. I mean, think even the Celtic element, whatever, the Gallic, Gallo-Roman culture especially was a big deal, right? Also in the creation of what we know as Frankish power, right? And as we were saying before, the Germanic element wasn't, in the former lands of the Holy Roman Empire, demographically, overwhelming. It were just a real, a substantially, minor minority, right? So what happened there was something at the level of the thought and the level of the opportunities that the local communities took, right? But anyhow, today we talked about too much, perhaps. I like to discuss this because, again, when we descend in the details, we can understand better what all this means. But it's still important to have a comprehensive understanding of the same, a comprehensive picture of the same. For today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.